Hi, everyone. You're very welcome to our webinar today on the SRESS T's and C's. We're just going to wait a minute to allow everybody to come into the room, and I will share the deck and then we'll get going. Hi, everyone. You're very welcome to our webinar today at lunchtime on Friday the 31st on the small-scale renewable electricity support scheme and the grid update webinar. Thanks for being flexible. I know that a lot of you were already signed up to our webinar from last week, and I hope everybody has recovered from the storm that we had and happily is able to make this week's webinar. So I'll just get going through some of the housekeeping, I suppose, rules that we just like to keep so that we can have an organised session. Firstly, just to say, my name's Kathleen Moore. I'm an executive on the Sustainable Energy Communities programme. And you're very welcome today. The event is being recorded, and you'll probably note that you are muted and your cameras are off as well. If you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A button. We will endeavour to answer any of the ones that we can as we go through the webinar, and we'll have 15 minutes at the end to also answer some of your questions. We will share the recording of the webinar after today. It'll be sometime next week, and any of the questions that have been answered will be part of that sharing. I'll put a link into a survey that we'd love your thoughts on in relation to how the webinar worked for you in terms of answering some of your key questions and any feedback that you might have. We'd love to hear your thoughts so that we can constantly improve. So those are the kind of the little bits of housekeeping that is good to kind of go through at the beginning. And then just to introduce the presenters who will be speaking to you today, we have Emma McCanney, who is part of the Renewable Electricity Division with the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. Then we'll have Gillian Baker, who's Programme Manager with on SRESS, and she's with us in SEAI. We have Tom Bruton, who is an advisor from BioXL, and then we will have Rory Mullan on afterwards, who is from MullanGrid, and then we will have 15 minutes, hopefully, to go through some of your questions. And this is the agenda that we're going to go through today. We'll have an introduction to SRESS. We'll go through the community enabling framework. Then we'll have an overview of SRESS. There'll be a bit of time dedicated then to the grid update, ESBN planning standards, and then we should have time for questions. So with that, I will hand over to Emma McCanney. Emma.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. My name is Emma McCanney. I work as part of the Small Scale and Communities team in the Renewable Electricity Division in the department. Firstly, thank you to the team at SEAI for organising the webinar today and to everyone who took their time to come along. The new programme for government is strongly supportive of small-scale and community-owned renewables and commits to promoting and to simplifying market access for community-owned solar and wind projects. So we're delighted that SRESS opened for applications on Monday just gone. SRESS will enable communities, farmers, businesses and projects above 50 kilowatts to 6 megawatts, offering a simpler offer them the opportunity to maximise their participation in the energy transition through the generation of renewable electricity for export to the grid. It's designed for community SME and farm export projects above 50 kilowatts up to 6 megawatts, and it offers a simpler, de-risked route to market without an auction or performance bonds. So this will align more closely to the experience and capacity of the community sector. Instead of being auction-based, support for the projects will be through guaranteed tariffs. Community tariffs are the highest, reflecting the additional development and financial challenges faced by these groups. It's also a reflection of public policy preference, ensuring a sustainable pathway for community renewable energy projects. For example, solar projects in SRESS will receive a guaranteed tariff 20% higher than the average community price in the most recent RES auction for community projects in 2022. And just to say that Tom will go into more detail on the tariffs and volumes in his presentation later on. So SRES has been developed for projects that don't fall within the categories of the smaller microgen support scheme and the larger competitive RES. So SRES completes this wide range of options that enable the public to participate in the delivery of renewable electricity generation. So in addition to SRES, we're also working on assessing barriers to communities, and in this regard, we're hopeful for European funding to carry out a piece of work on barriers to communities and identifying solutions, including to the issue of grid access, which is faced by community projects. SRES is a great opportunity for communities, and we'd encourage community projects that meet eligibility criteria to apply for the scheme as soon as possible, because we want community projects to be delivered. And finally, just to say from a practical perspective, the SRES application form together with terms and conditions and a non-technical summary document, including FAQ, are available on our department's website at gov.ie/SRES. And if you've any additional queries, apart from those dealt with through our FAQ, please get in touch with our team at sres@dec.gov.ie. Thanks again for listening today, and I'll hand over to Gillian.
Great, thanks very much, Emma, and thanks, Kathleen, for organising this afternoon's session, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the Community Enabling Framework. My name's Gillian Baker. I'm the Programme Manager. I'm just conscious that we had a really successful year in 2024 in terms of new SECs joining the network. So just for those that are new to the programme, I'm just going to provide just a very brief overview of the programme. I'm going to try and take control. Kathleen's moved on. Perfect. Thanks, Kathleen. So before I go into the enabling framework, I just want to draw your attention to a very important public consultation that the department are running at the moment in relation to community benefit funds. So this is your opportunity to help shape the future kind of policy and you know, the frameworks around how community benefit funds come into your area. So there's 25 questions covering a host of different topics in terms of near neighbour payments, transparency, administration costs, fund committee composition, and various activities. The department are running an engagement event on the 5th at 10 a.m, both online and in person, and there's the details there if you are interested in joining. Next slide, please, Kathleen. So I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of where the policy came from in terms of community generation, but suffice to say it has been around for a number of years in various policy white papers, and the first time communities had an opportunity to participate in developing their own projects was in RES, and now we have SRES. So as Emma mentioned, just launched in 2024. So removing some of the complexities related to communities participating in a large auction with utility-based developers. So Tom's going to go through that in more detail. And just in terms of, you know, the wider European policy, like the communities being involved and benefiting and participating has been around in all of the renewable electricity directives, and it's kind of going from strength to strength. There's, you know, 4 mentions there. There's more in RED 3, but I just thought I'd highlight those 4 there. And Article 30, to increase public acceptance of renewable energy projects, member states should take appropriate measures to promote the participation of local communities in renewable energy projects. So that's what we're doing here now. So next slide, please. So our supports that we've had in place to help communities on their development journey for grid scale projects is similar to the SEC program, learning, planning and doing. So in the first instance, we want to give communities all the information they need to make informed decisions on whether to develop a project or not. So we've developed 9 information guides covering a host of development activities, from grid connections to the Irish electricity market to stakeholder engagement, really to give communities a better understanding of the journey ahead. And from there, we have trusted advisors. So we've appointed, we've had the framework in place now for, I think, about 2.5 years. We've trusted advisors who are experts in the renewable energy field that we can assign to a community to help them understand what's involved in developing a project in their area, identifying key risks and opportunities, primarily around grid planning and financing. And finally, we have enabling grants to support projects that have completed the feasibility stage and that are of lower risk. And the enabling grants will cover most of the project development costs. And now that we're moving on to SRESS, we are going to pivot all of our supports, including the enabling grant, towards that programme. And we're working with the department on finalising the exact shape of those grants and supports. And when we have further updates on those, we will provide them to you. Next slide there, please, Kathleen. And so as we've been going through the course of delivering the enabling framework, we're trying to address the challenges that we've come across and help communities insofar as we can within SEAI's remit. So one of the activities that we have been doing is doing county by county grid studies to help communities identify suitable sites in their locality. We found a number of communities were identifying sites a bit too far away from grid. The grid connection required deep reinforcements, which would be very costly for communities. So we have carried out 7 county studies to date, and we're now updating them in light of the new planning standards that ESBN have adopted, which Rory is going to go through. And we've got further plans for more grid studies in, 2025. So that's, I think, it from me. So I'm going to hand over to Tom now, who's going to go through more detail on SRESS. Thanks very much.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Gillian and colleagues, for the introduction. I'll just move ahead there quickly to outline the SRESS support just launched this week. It's, I mean, a lot of it is sort of self-evident. There's a good guidance on the department's website and a kind of a summary of the scheme, and all the detailed applications are available there. But it's targeted at wind and solar technologies only. It's guaranteeing a 15-year feed-in premium, a fixed tariff. I'll explain by way of example shortly what exactly that might entail. It's targeted at community-owned, small business and farmer-owned projects. It's been introduced as an alternative to the annual RES auctions, which small projects and communities had great difficulty participating in. And it's a volume-based scheme. I'll talk about that in a second. And it's a policy that's put in place from here to 2030. And then in the sort of scheme documentation that's been released, there's a commitment to review that in 3 years' time and see how it's functioning and where it's going. Okay. Yeah, your project needs to be reasonably well advanced to qualify for this, so you will have to have a final grant of planning. If you're a renewable energy community, you have a slight differentiation there in that you need a grid connection assessment from ESB networks or from EirGrid, most likely ESB in this case, or a grid offer, but you don't need to be contracted or have paid large sums over to ESB. Whereas if you're an SME or other type of project owner, you have to have signed those connections and paid for them with ESB. You need the land, you need a legal entity established. I mean, it's kind of self-evident that you can't sign a contract or enter into a framework or grant with the department unless you have a legal entity established. The land needs to be in control of that legal entity. You have to have a bank account opened and all kinds of other administrative processes in place. There's all those particulars are set out in the application form and checklists on the department's website. There are various other rules about project splitting as well in there that to basically avoid combining smaller sites into a larger site or avoid splitting of larger sites to benefit from the scheme. Just to, when I mentioned that it's volume based, these are the initial volumes announced at the launch of the scheme. There's two separate volume pots, one for renewable energy communities and the other for SME or other eligible owner types. But by far and away the biggest pot is reserved for RECs or for communities, whether that be in the sort of medium scale category there. So while 25 megawatts might not seem a lot for small scale solar projects between 50 kilowatts and 1 megawatt, that's at least 25 projects, assuming they're all 1 megawatt or less. And there's a quota there for 14 projects in the solar category, at least 14 projects, of maximum 6 megawatts each, and at least 3 projects of maximum 6 megawatts each in the wind category. Yeah, it's hard to know. Applications are open as of this week, and it's on a first come first served basis. So time will tell how the uptake is on that scheme. There's higher volumes across the SME sector, but again, the same principles apply. In terms of tariffs, yeah, I mean, a detailed set of tariffs were announced in December. This was after a long period of industry consultation and various independent reports for the department to try and arrive at the right scheme and the right tariffs. I mean, the tariffs are there as they're set out in the table. The renewable energy community tariffs range from €90 per megawatt hour for wind projects, up to €150 per megawatt hour for the smaller scale solar projects up to 1 megawatt. It's pitched at a level, I would say, to target like the best or most commercially achievable projects, basically the lowest hanging fruit. In fairness, the rates do compare very favourably with the RESS strike price. Like the maximum price under the most recent RESS auction was €110 per megawatt hour for solar and €93 per megawatt hour for wind. So certainly on the solar side, it's well above the prevailing RES rates, and on the wind side, it's more or less around the RES strike price for wind. And that's in the community category. The tariffs are somewhat lower for SME owned and other farmer owned and sole trader owned projects. So again, I mean, projects would just have to get modelled across 15 years and work out where they sit economically and whether this tariff works for that particular site. And that's just how it's structured. Just to not to delve too much into the detail of it, but it is worth understanding how this price is achieved and talking about the market interface. So, and the focus today is on community-owned generators. So, like you as a community-owned generator, you're obliged to enter a PPA contract, and you won't have a direct interface with the market. You'll have an arm's length relationship via your PPA provider. PPA is a power purchase agreement. So you will deliver your power through ESB networks. The PPA provider will bid your power into the market every half hour. The PPA provider will settle with the customer, and ultimately the PPA provider will give back to you a fixed price for every unit of electricity that you supply into the market. I have a kind of a worked example or illustration of how that works in practice on the next slide. So this one is just showing in practice how a two-way tariff would work for a solar example. So in this example, this would be a solar project between 1 and 6 megawatts, say 5 megawatts here. And that would be entitled to €140 per megawatt hour fixed tariff for 15 years. And that simplifies matters for the generator, but in practice, sitting behind that is the PPA provider who settles the account with the consumer via a public service obligation levy. So clearly in this sort of example here that I'm showing, there's no output and no payment for nighttime. It's solar, but then there's clear times a day when there's prices that are above €140 per megawatt hour. So during the morning peak and evening peak, you can see the line in light green there. Prices do actually go up above the strike price, and then for large parts of the day, the prices would tend to be well down below the strike price. So in the periods where market price is higher than the strike price, there's actually a refund or a payment made back to the public service obligation levy, effectively to the consumer, to make sure that the generator does not get more than €140 per megawatt hour. But then for the long periods when price is much lower than that, there's a mechanism to draw support payment back from the consumer. So this is what's meant by the two-way tariff, to ultimately mean that you're supported at that level, nothing less, nothing more. That's basically it. Just wanted to highlight some commercial terms and conditions as well that come along with it. It's all there in the sort of detailed information packs on the website as well. But every single project is required to set up a community benefit fund, whether that be 50 kilowatts or 100 megawatts. And this applies to the small res or SRESS tariff as well. Now, as Gillian has mentioned earlier, there is an ongoing consultation there, which is asking questions about how to handle this for the much smaller projects, because there can be quite a bit of admin and overhead entailed for not very much money, particularly if you come down below a couple of megawatts. Even on a 5 megawatt solar project, €2 per megawatt hour is just about €10,000 a year. So I encourage you all to look at that consultation community benefit if it's of relevance or interest as well. There's indexation is included in the tariff, so a component of it, 30% of it, is deemed to be the element that's exposed to inflation. So the theory is like you've invested year one at a given price, and then your operational costs and your ongoing payments are probably subject to inflation each year. So 30% of the tariff is then indexed up over time. So that is a help in your financial model. Something that sort of differs from the auction policy is that in this particular tariff, you got to watch out for constraint and curtailment and oversupply. So that there's no, if you're knocked off the network by the network operator, you will lose revenue for that period. Whereas under RES, you would have been compensated for that. Yeah. Just moving on to the type of renewable energy communities that are eligible. This definition is the same as under RES. To apply to be an eligible community, there's certain characteristics about the legal entity. It has to be an open voluntary group. It has to not be the primary professional activity of the members of the group. it has not non-financial profits, non-financial aims, and supports environmental and societal benefits locally. And it must involve an SEC, which most of you are members of or involved in. Last year, the CRU introduced proximity rules into it, which get stipulated local control of the project. Now that's in the gift of the community to define what exactly that means. But it's an important part that it's seen to benefit the local community and be controlled by the local community. Just specifically on that, like that was an important change. And then in SRESS, there's an important distinction being made between those who own the project and control it, and those who are participating but are not involved in the control of the renewable energy community. So, like in this example, you could see a situation where people from outside the community or from some other part of Ireland could invest in a project, provided they're not controlling the project or making management decisions or deciding what to do with the surplus or benefit of the project. So that should be helpful, I think, in terms of opening up possibilities to support and invest in projects where it's not all available locally. There's a raft of detail in. I would actually say the application process for SRESS is slightly more onerous than RES. Like RES, there's an online structured system and track record of 5 or 6 years of running the online auctions at this stage. But this one is largely based around filling up a sort of detailed application forms and certifications and sending them into the department. I mean, the initial financial commitment is very light, so there's no requirement to place a bid bond or to bond the project, unlike RES. But then once you've entered into the contract, there are a series of onerous enough implementation milestones, and then you have to evidence back to the department that the renewable energy community is making substantial progress in delivering the project. Essentially, like your project has been assigned volume from a limited pot, possibly at the expense of others in this process. I suppose, I mean, I've just put in this table here, and all this information will be available online later, but to highlight some of the critical ones. But like the big one there is the first major financial milestone would be to accept your grid connection agreement and pay a large payment to ESB Networks within 9 months of signing the contract with the department here. So if that doesn't happen, effectively, you're going to miss your long stop date and the contract to be rescinded. After that, there's various other milestones around confirmation, certified declaration that your funding's in place to construct the project. Then you have to make another large second stage payment on your grid connection agreement to ESB. And one of the latter milestones is that you have to evidence that you put the community benefit fund in place. And then ultimately you have 57 months from the letter of offer to get your project live and running. I think that this is about 14 months longer, I think, from memory, than I think I'd have checked the documents, but it's over a year extra over and above an SME or a farmer-owned project will have, I think, 48 months to deliver the project, or a lesser long stop. So look, that's the sort of summary of the details of the scheme as I've seen them so far. It's only open to applications this week. Happy to sort of discuss it or take questions under the Q&A, and advise you all to kind of look hard at your financial model and the obligations you're entering into before making an application. Right, thank you. Just hand over to Rory Mullan, who's going to give an update on policy update on recent changes by ESB networks.
Yep, thanks, Tom. If we can maybe jump on to the next slide there, Kathleen. So, like what I'm giving an update today is there's been some positive changes by ESB networks on their connection planning standards. So it's basically the rules they apply when they're studying grid connection applications. And it's really to do with the amount of capacity in transformers and substations, because one of the main limiting factors as to how much generation can connect without quite expensive upgrades. So the way ESB currently study these generators is a lot of the substations have 2 transformers. So that's what the picture is showing there. There's 2 transformers in a substation, but ESB only consider there's 1 always available for generators. So it's the normal network minus 1, and that's the way they've been doing their studies. And unfortunately, the limitation on transformers of transformer capacity has been one of the reasons why when we've studied counties to look for available capacity, there was a lot of areas were shown as red because there wasn't any spare transformer capacity without expensive upgrades. So I think there's one extra line there, Kathleen, just down the bottom, that the positive change that's coming now. Sorry, I think if you just click on, the positive change that ESB have allowed in their new planning standards that they're starting to apply from 2020 or sort of mid 2024 onwards is that they allow more overloads on these transformers when they're considering the amount of capacity of generation that can connect. So they allow up to 130% now of generation capacity, and that's they allow for the fact that there is actually a second transformer there, and they can overload, I suppose, the transformers at times. So that's a positive change, which means that when we study substations, we're seeing there's a lot more of them with available capacity than there had been. So we go on to the next slide. So that's the first positive change. The second one that's come through is that that ESB are also allowing what's called a diversity factor. And that's just to consider that not all, and this is for solar generation, that not all solar generators are going to be at full output at the same time. And obviously different solar radiance in different areas and panels facing slightly different directions, stuff like that there. So that factor is 0.78. So they'll look at your planned installed capacity of solar and they'll apply this factor. And again, it helps maybe create more capacity on the system. And it's maybe ESB being a wee bit less conservative about how they plan and operate their system. Now, these changes, the 2 I've mentioned, the over installation of 30% and the 0.78, they're not going to make any of these changes retrospective for people who are already contracted. But from speaking to ESB networks, they don't believe this actually affects any existing community projects from what they tell me. And they're quite confident that this does create a lot of more capacity on the system. ESB's calculations maybe up to 1.4 gigawatts, 1,400 megawatts. That'll be across every substation in the country. We're still waiting for ESB to formally publish these standards, but they're actually the ones that I'm referencing today. We've talked to them, in meetings about them, and we understand they're already starting to apply them in connection studies. If you actually look at a very simple example, which is what's really in this table. So previously, when we would have looked at, for example, the substation, just say for example, Selbridge substation that's fed from a 110 kV substation called Griffin Rath, we would have been saying there wasn't really enough capacity in that substation, so it was red. Whereas the more updated study, as Gillian mentioned earlier, was done for Kildare, showing there now is capacity in that substation with these new planning standards. So that's going to be positive for people looking for areas to connect community projects. Now, at the same time, when we go on to the next slide, we'll see this is really just one layer when ESB are looking at connections, the transformer capacity, but it's probably of all the layers that usually results in projects not being viable, transformer capacity is probably the most prevalent. But there are other things that could mean that even though if there's transformer capacity in your area, there may be still more expensive upgrades out there. And one of them is maybe the capacity of the local 38 kV network, so those wires to connect all these 38 kV substations together. And what's been really, what's been shown, to demonstrate this is just in this map is the 38 kV network between basically Swords all the way up to Drogheda. And you can see it's a very long network. It's like 40 kilometers. So depending on how much generation is connected to different 38 kV substations, and there's already a lot of contracted generation in some of these substations, in this example, in other substations around the country, you could, start overloading the 38 kV network. So there could be capacity in the transformers, but the network becomes a limitation. And this is partly what gets looked at whenever you're doing your sort of feasibility studies and your more detailed studies. And eventually when ESB networks are doing their connection studies, they'll look at all this in a lot of detail. But you do want to sort of be aware of it as early as you can in the project, because it could end up with expensive upgrades that may challenge the viability of the project. So that's sort of the update around the ESB changes to their planning standards, which are in the round quite positive. So the next slide, I just wanted to talk a bit about, and you can probably click on here, Kathleen, because there's some more text just to bring it all up in one go. So the actual connection offer process, so the way you apply and get given a grid connection offer and agreement by ESB networks, that's changing in 2025. And it's been driven by changes and requirements coming from Europe to speed up the pace at which we develop all renewable projects. So it came through what was called the RED 3 European requirements. And what they're basically asking each member state is to look at their processes to see how projects can become consented. And when I mean consented, get planning permission, get their grid connection offer, and do all that within a 2-year period. So previously, a lot of projects were almost doing this in series. They went and got grid and then planning, or planning and grid, whichever way the process worked for them. This is driving us to have to parallel the two of these processes, the grid process and the planning process. And this is a change for community projects, because the way community projects have been processed for grid connections in the past 2 or 3 years, it was through what was known as the ECP2 policy, and that was quite positive towards community projects. What you could do there is, before you get planning, you could apply to ESB for what was called a grid connection assessment. The cost of that was €2,000, and then ESB give you a grid connection assessment with the detail of the connection method and cost for your project, and then that capacity was held for a 2-year period while you went off and got planning. And there was a good number of community projects processed under that, and there's a couple still being processed under that applied last November. So the last batch under ECP2 closed last year. So the new process that's coming in for new community projects is under another big long acronym for us, ECP GSS, but it's the enduring connection process for generators and system service providers. That's basically batteries, but it's basically just an acronym to describe the new connection offer process. So in this case, community projects are going to be processed alongside non-community projects, whereas previously there was a special rule set for community projects. I suppose the big change for community projects is previously they could apply before they got planning. Now they have to apply when they submit planning, after they submit planning. So you have to go and apply for planning first. There is going to be additional fees to go through the connection offer process at this stage. So we will be above the €2,000. Now we're waiting for ESB networks to publish new connection costs. They have to go through an approval process with the regulator. So we'll know that over the next month or two. And when they become available, I'm sure that'll be disseminated, through SEAI and the SECs. We're also waiting to get more information that, the grid connection assessment was a way of you engaging early with ESB. There is maybe the potential of some new type of early engagement process, but again, that's something along with the fees that ESB networks are currently discussing with the CRU. So hopefully later this quarter, we'll have more information for people on that. So this new batch process, where you need to have submitted your planning, that'll open up for applications up to September this year. So there'll be a new batch being processed from September, and you have to be given a connection offer within 12 months. So you'll have submitted your planning and you're given a connection offer 12 months. And the idea is that your actual planning has been processed in parallel. And then hopefully both the grid and the planning will happen within this 2-year window as required by Europe. When you get your grid connection offer, in about 12 months after you apply, you then have to have received planning to have accepted that offer. One of the positive decisions made by the regulator is to accept the offer. It was previously 10,000 a megawatt for all projects, including community. That's been reduced to 5,000 per megawatt for community projects. So it is a new connection offer process, and it does have impacts on how you develop your projects. And because it's new as well, I suppose we'll be learning exactly how it works as we go along. But there is a reasonable amount of engagement between the regulator, ESB, and industry, including the people supporting community projects on this. So I think that's the end of that update.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom and Rory and Gillian and Emma. That was really interesting, and we really appreciate your delving into the detail and going through it for us here in the Sustainable Energy Community team. I know Maeve, who works on the SEAI Community Benefit Fund, was going through the questions. And Maeve, do you want to call out any of the questions in the Q&A that you'd like to put to some of the panel here?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen, and thanks to the panel. I think back at the opening of the meeting, Stevie asked if DECC could direct crew to allow cost of connecting to grid to be absorbed by all electricity customers. Cost of grid connection is well known as a significant barrier. So I don't know if anyone has any feedback on grid connection costs.
I do believe as part of the consultation, this new process, ECP GSS, there was consideration of connection costs, and by the regulator. And at that stage, they said they weren't going to change their current policy of charging all generators, including communities, for their connection costs. So that's where that currently sits. Now, there is some review of connection charging and costs going on by ESB, ERG, and CRU. So there may be some further consultations in that across 25 into 2026. But in terms of the general principle, the CRU are not in any way minded at the moment to change that. And ultimately, it's the regulator who sets connection policy, including charging policy for generators.
That's great. Thanks, Rory.
Sorry, Maeve,
sorry, Emma.
and just to add, just as we set out, that the department, we are working on assessing the barriers, including grid costs, so trying to work to identify solutions as well to it. Thanks.
Great. Peter asked a question about battery storage, which I followed up with. So initially, solar and wind will be supported through SRESS. And just to highlight, Elaine followed up with a question on sites that might have both solar and batteries. And Tom has provided a comprehensive answer there in the chat. So just in case anyone needs to unclap their comments like I did for that one. I suppose Ivan asked if there's any funding stream for grid connection infrastructure, but I think we might have just covered that one. Isabella asked, can sub 1 megawatt projects hook into wires to get to grid? So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on sub 1 megawatt projects there.
In terms of the connection method for less than 1 megawatt projects, this has happened. There's been projects connected this way. There is 20 kV, 10 kV networks crisscrossing our countryside. Unfortunately, there's a lot of those wires that had poles broken recently, but those types of circuits, there is at times capacity for between half a megawatt and a megawatt to connect to those circuits. Now, it depends on a whole multitude of things, like the distance you are away from a substation, any other generation on the circuit, the size of the circuit, just whatever conductor was put on it, and the voltage, some's 10 kV, some's 20 kV. But there has been projects up to about a megawatt connected into 3-phase networks. But maybe it's a wee bit restrictive at the moment for projects to be viable, though, is you still need to build an MV substation, TSB standards, and and it's a very similar substation that would be required for, say, a 4 or 5 megawatt project. So that sort of fixed cost for the connection, it will probably make the connection cost, at the higher end of the range. But it is technically possible to connect in 500 kilowatt, 10 megawatt projects into MV networks. That's the question. But you do have to look at it, project by project to see, if it's going to be viable in your case. And then there is some more work to do. Look at the overall economic viability, considering just the scale of the project and the connection costs associated with those connections.
Sorry, Maeve, can I just add the up to 1 megawatt projects that they can avail, the tariff applying to them is the highest one as well. So to reflect that there are those fixed costs across projects, regardless of the size.
Super, thanks folks. Isabella asked, have the ESB availability maps been updated with the new factors and availability? I suppose the heat maps that you can see publicly on the ESB website might be one for you, Rory.
I'd need to actually go back and check. I know their plan when the last conversation we had with them, I think was back in December, and I think they did have a plan to update them. I'll be honest, I haven't gone back and checked recently, but it's something I'll follow up with to check that they have done that. I don't know if anybody else is aware of ESB have done it yet. I think the issue is they mightn't have actually formally published the new standards yet. So while they're applying them and we're talking about them, they're still going through the last bit of the formal process.
Super. Colin asks, the new 5k megawatt fee to accept a connection, is this pro rata for smaller projects? For example, will a 100 kilowatt cost €500? And maybe that's been, Tom, sorry, you took care of that one there. That's super. Gavin asked, where do I register for the community benefit fund consultation event? So I will pop the link into the Q&A, but I think we could also include links to the events and links to the actual consultation on the follow-up with the slides, and then everything will be all kind of neatly packaged together. Folks, so what is the threshold beyond which a connection agreement must be sought? For example, small rooftop solar on a household doesn't go through a connection application. What is the threshold which means that a connection agreement is needed?
I presume maybe this question isn't particular to this SRESS scheme, but the actual answer is every time you connect any generation onto any site, including domestically, you do have to inform ESB of that generation. So even the rooftop solar in my house, you do have to fill out some forms. So if you go on the ESB Network's website, it's reasonably good. Like there's different, depending on the scale of your generation, whether it's domestic rooftop or micro or mini, or small scale, they've different ranges depending on the size of the scheme. They outline the process you go through, but in all of the cases you have to inform ESB. At the very smaller scale, it's more like inform and fit. So you're informing them you've done it, but you're still informing them. Whereas in the larger scale, you're actually applying and they come back with an updated agreement. But for the types of, this is more sort of rooftop queries, I presume, the ESB Network's website's quite good at explaining the process you'll have to go through depending on the scale of rooftop scheme you're putting in.
That's great, thank you, Rory. I know Jim has his hand up, but I'm not sure if we have the technical ability to unmute mics. Do we, Kathleen?
Yeah, I can unmute him there. We allow Jim there. I think you're unmuted. You want to try speaking?
Yeah. Sorry, folks. I'm not that good at typing, and it's kind of a long-winded question. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
we can indeed.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. First of all, thanks very much for the presentation, Gillian, Emma, Kathleen, Maeve, Tom, and Rory. This new ECP GSS it seems like it's putting an awful lot more responsibility onto communities before they apply for grid connection, and a lot more costs. You're going to have planning permission in place, planning permission not in place but applied for. So there's costs involved in that. Up until now, you could identify the landowner agreement, and then you could make a grid connection for €2,000, and that was the only cost. And of course, you got the support of the trusted advisors for the initial feasibility and the detailed feasibility. But now it looks like we have to submit planning permission as well, which is going to be another additional cost. So I suppose, Emma, for yourselves, that's definitely going to be a constraint for communities going forward. That's a barrier that has been put in our way. And I suppose then to the SEAI, is there any plan? I know we've supports up and now with a trusted advisor. Will there be additional supports with regard to planning, application and funding for same for communities under the new scheme?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I suppose, the change for communities, from a community perspective is a kind of a step backwards, I suppose, in the sense that it does make it more challenging. I think in terms of the CRU and implementing the European directives around timelines and, for consenting, the planning and grid need to be done in parallel. As was mentioned earlier, in order to achieve a timeline of 2 years for consenting for renewable energy projects. So I think, while it was acknowledged and recognised by all the stakeholders involved, I think it was very much the CRU felt that their hands were tied and there was no choice but to adopt a more streamlined approach. And I suppose in terms of the supports that we're providing, we will be providing enabling supports under SRESS as well. And it is something that we're looking at as how we can pivot them and best to make sure they fit the needs of the community, particularly around the new GSS application process. So but as soon as we have an update on that, we'll let you know. And the enabling grants that we have under RES, like they were to support communities getting their own planning consultants as well. So that's what will be anticipated to be in place for SRES. So it should certainly help communities. It won't cover everything, but we'll do as much as we can anyway to support communities in that process.
That's great. Thanks very much, Gillian.
Sorry, Jim, just in terms of with regard to planning permission as being a requirement of SRES, the idea behind that was to allow that for projects that are as mature as possible, so that are fairly advanced to avail of the available volumes in order to get the projects up and running as quickly as possible. Okay.
Yeah, I understand that, Emma, but I suppose just given that we're in the process of applying, we've applied for a grid connection, and it was a difficult enough process as it is at the moment, but this has made it more difficult, and it's really, I feel it's not going to assist or encourage communities to apply, because there's so much work to be done up front now before you even apply for a grid connection. So yeah, that's just my feedback.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. Colin asks, will you be able to provide examples of the fixed cost regardless of size? So for example, that would be the same for a 100 kilowatt project as a 1 megawatt project. Don't know if the panel has any feedback.
I think we were talking about grid connections, and like 100 kilowatt is really different than like 100 kilowatts you might be able to accommodate, but I don't know if it's actually under particular work under this scheme, but you do have pole mounted transformers 100, 200 kilowatts. So if you are able to connect into one of them, well, that is sort of a different connection. Whereas if you're talking about anything sort of 500 kilowatts and above, you're into requiring one of ESB's ground mounted substations. And like ESB have a standard price. Well, it wasn't 24, might increase a bit in 25. I think the ESB price for that, containerized substation was 285,000. And then you have civil works to do. You still have to connect it back over to the MV grid, depending on how far you are away. And there could be some additional metering costs and all that there. So you can quite quickly see your 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 of a grid cost for a circa 500 kilowatt to megawatt project. So that's an example anyway on the grid side. I'm assuming there's other fixed costs, whether it's capital costs or development costs that would also come into play.
Thanks, Rory. I think we've got time for a couple more. So Joseph asked, does the ECP GSS cover hybrid solar and battery systems, or for demand/flexibility response?
And maybe just as we're waiting for a panel member to answer that question, just to say we have 4 minutes left on the webinar. So if you do have a question that you would like answered, put it into the Q&A. And if we don't have time to answer it before we finish up at 2, we will endeavour to we'll put all the questions, as I mentioned, into the deck that we share with all registered attendees. So put your questions into the chat. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The ECP GSS does consider, how to treat batteries, when they're sharing sites with renewable projects. As the phrase was used, hybrid. And the European policy say that the battery should be treated as a renewable project, so they are sort of done under that 1-year process. The new thing that really needs to come out along to maybe make hybrid connections for batteries along with the likes of solar work is the sharing of MEC. So if you're doing 5 megawatt solar and a 5 megawatt battery, at the moment they treat that as like a 10 megawatt project. There is a consultation we're expecting out from the regulator later this quarter about moving towards sharing MEC across technologies like the batteries and solar, so you can actually share that grid capacity between the solar and the battery project. That's the evolution that's sort of coming down the road, but we're not there yet in connection policy and the policies required as to how we're going to operate these and treat them in the market. But there is a direction of travel there, but it's, and it's in the climate action plan to advance all these hybrid policies, but they're not technically there yet at the moment. There's a number of years before they're going to be there.
Thanks, Rory. And we might just squeeze in one final one. We're asking, Rory, are the Zoop grid connection assessments, as 12 months seems like a long time to wait for ESBN to give you an offer/assessment? And I suppose just for ourselves from SEAI, to add to that one, under the Community Enabling Framework, we do offer free detailed feasibility studies. So we would look at things kind of like grid viability, for example. So I think that's something we could also link in the follow-up email, the link to our page and kind of how to apply for these enabling supports. But I don't know if anyone else has any more feedback on that one.
Yeah, that's definitely the advice to the projects. Regardless of change the ECP GSS, you need to be doing feasibility studies to see if the projects are viable before you progress too far. And as Maeve's outlined, there's support to do that, and the likes of myself and Tom review those reports, so we see them coming in, and we see there's reasonably good quality of them, so they will give you a good steer as to how viable your grid is at that point.
Okay, thanks a million for that, Rory. So I think we might finish there. As Kathleen mentioned, if you want to pop questions into the chat or follow up via email, please reach out and let us know.
Yeah, and into the Q&A. I realized I said the wrong channel there. So not into the chat, but into the Q&A. But thanks everybody for your time, and I appreciate flexing your calendar to be here today after postponing last week's webinar. Thanks very much to the panel, to Rory, Tom, Emma, Gillian and Maeve for answering all the questions and going into that detail. And we'll be sharing the deck and all of the questions as well, as mentioned, in due course. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.